like to welcome the panelists and also all the audience members to our second event of the webinar series on minorities and COVID-19. In this webinar, we will be focusing on equality, discrimination, and COVID-19. Why did we choose to also have a session on this topic? I'm sure as you've been following the media coverage on COVID-19, you've often heard that although the virus does affect some groups in a particular way, so elderly people, those with other illnesses, for example, it has often been portrayed as an illness that is in itself non-discriminatory. So that can affect everyone, and that doesn't distinguish between rich or poor and types of populations and so on. However, it is indeed the case that this COVID-19 does have an especially devastating effect on vulnerable groups, such as minorities, for example, and also on the effects that we try to ensure minority non-discrimination and minority equality with. So we'd like to shed some light on these specific discriminatory effects of COVID-19 on minorities, also to discuss how they can be counteracted, and as well as to give an outlook on our potential future developments. First of all, I'd like to introduce today's speakers to you. We have at first, Dr. Fernand de Varennes, who is since 2017 the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues. He is also an extraordinary professor at the Faculty of Law of the University of Pretoria, an adjunct professor at the National University of Ireland at Galway, and at Cheng Yu Tang University at Hong Kong. He's renowned as one of the world's leading experts on international human rights and minorities, and has authored over 200 publications in more than 30 languages. As our second panelist with us today, I'd like to introduce to you Emma Lantschner, Professor of Law at the University of Graz in Austria. She studied law in Innsbruck and Brussels, did a doctorate in Graz with research on monitoring mechanisms under bi- and multilateral agreements on the protection of minorities. And she was also a former colleague here from the Eurac Institute of Minority Rights, and is now at the Center for Southeast European Studies at the University of Graz. In 2019, she did her habilitation on reflexive governance in the enforcement and promotion of the right to equality and non-discrimination, the relevance for the EU enlargement context and beyond. As our third panelist, I'd like to introduce Roberta Medda-Windischer to you. She's a senior researcher at the Eurac Institute for Minority Rights and an international lawyer specialized in human rights and protection of minorities in international law, diversity, and new minorities stemming from migration. She's worked as a legal officer for various international organizations, including the European Court of Human Rights, the UNHCR, and the OSCE. So welcome you to all of you, and thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. Last, let me also introduce myself. My name is Katharina Crepaz. I'm a political scientist and a senior researcher at the Institute for Minority Rights at Eurac Research, and I will be chairing today's session. Before we get to the contents of all of this, let me also pass on some organizational details to the audience. Our webinar will last for 1 hour, so until 4 p.m. You can, of course, also as audience members ask questions. To do so, please write your questions in the chat. And our question taker, my colleague from the Institute, Kerstin Wonisch, will then pass a selection of them on to me. So you can also get engaged and try to have your questions in the webinar as well. To get into the key matter of today's session, I'd like to ask the panelists for their opening statements, and for this I'd like to pose a very open question. So judging from what we know so far, how, in your view, is COVID-19 affecting minority equality or minority discrimination. And I would like to start with Fernand de Varennes, followed then by Emma Lantschner and Roberta Medda-Windischer. Please, Fernand.
Thank you, Katharina. Good morning, everyone. Well, it's morning for me here in Canada, and it's very nice and sunny, as a matter of fact. First, allow me to congratulate Eurac for this most timely and rich series of webinar discussions. I saw the first episode you had with the OSCE Commissioner on National Minorities, Ambassador Zanier, and others, of course, and this was, I thought, particularly instructive and invaluable. I would answer your question, or enter your question, by pointing out that, in my opinion, there are two main dimensions there, in relation to the subject of equality, discrimination, and COVID, which bring up what I think is the most concern for me, and that I will be briefly exploring. First, how and why inequality and discrimination aggravates the vulnerability of certain segments of society during this pandemic. We all know this is the case with older people, you referred to it, the poor, those with existing preconditions. But there are also minorities, migrants, refugees, and the stateless who find themselves left out and particularly affected. And this, in my opinion, mainly involves state obligations and human rights. But second, there are also wider social phenomena, and I would say even political opportunism fueled by the COVID pandemic that leads to the stigmatization and othering of certain groups by segments of the population in a surprisingly significant number of countries. We are seeing minorities being increasingly blamed, if not for the origins of the virus, but at least for its spreading, and therefore being dangerous threats. This leads to some minorities being feared and even targeted by more and more hate speech, and unfortunately, even acts of physical violence, some of it life-threatening in some countries. And this mainly involves the failure of state authorities to effectively protect the human rights of those who are most vulnerable, particularly minorities, but also migrants, refugees, and millions of stateless people. By the way, because it is sometimes ignored, it's important to point out, in my opinion, that most migrants, refugees, and stateless are also at the same time usually members of religious, ethnic, or linguistic minorities. This isn't always appreciated, in my opinion, also. So in relation to the first category, I would identify three main areas where state authorities are not complying with their human rights obligations, and thus aggravating the impact and the vulnerability of minorities, migrants, refugees, and the stateless. First, entrenched inequality, such as when minorities may not have access to healthcare services, have no or little access to healthcare services, to medical testing, to identify the virus, or when they're not or very little provided information in their own language so that they can be properly informed on the measures to protect themselves, their families, and members of their community. I am aware of a recent study in Europe which identifies only 21% of members of linguistic minorities having received COVID-related health information in their own language. For their part, in the case of migrants and refugees, you have situations where they were simply ignored by governments in a way which is, in my opinion, discriminatory, until it was too late and you started having the virus exploding within some of these communities. Some minorities, such as the Roma in Europe, the Bedouin in parts of the Middle East, including Israel, are treated, I think we have to be quite blunt about this, are treated discriminatorily in terms of even of basic access to healthcare, and which also suggests, obviously, discrimination by state authorities. And there are plenty of linguistic minorities who are little or even not at all informed in their own language by public and health authorities, which in a time of crisis like this one, that's likely to be discriminatory, to actually breach the legal obligations of states. And by the way, it's also hugely ineffective if you truly want to protect all of your population, all of the state's population. 2, the entrenched inequality of some poorer minorities means, in some cases, their lifestyle or even their diet makes them particularly vulnerable. You may have heard there are studies, recent studies in the United States and the United Kingdom, which have confirmed that Black or Hispanic and other ethnic minorities are disproportionately affected by the virus, even hugely so. Public authorities, it's clear to me, need to consider the vulnerability of those who are also, for example, in refugee camps, or the tens or even hundreds of millions of people who are refugees, when you have no other choice as poor families or sometimes migrant workers to be living 5, 6, 10 or even more in a very confined space. Or, for example, that you cannot buy a face mask or sanitizer, or even do not have access to soap or running water. I mean, we do have, even here in Europe, communities, quite often minorities, who do not have access to the most basic forms of protection they need. And that's the reality for millions around the world. And as I said, even some members of particular minorities here in Europe. So the virus can explode in those conditions unless state authorities are sensitive to and act to address this reality to protect effectively minorities, migrants, refugees, and particularly the stateless. The second category that I mentioned at the very beginning and the very last one involves broader social phenomena. And that's to illustrate in a very targeted way, the increasing hate speech and scapegoating of minorities in relation to the spread of the COVID virus. In some parts of the world, you have Asians or Muslims or Roma or Black minorities who are eyed suspiciously and are blamed as sources or are blamed for propagating the virus, which easily feeds into a nationalistic and otherizing discourse that is also at times in some countries being instrumentalized by political opportunists, nationalists, and extremists. There have been, I'm sure some of you are aware of reports of attacks against Asians in parts of Europe, of Roma being threatened for congregating or not respecting physical distancing, of Muslims being deemed to be super spreaders of the virus. And even more worrying, in my opinion, are some extreme right-wing groups that have started to use the pandemic as part of, I would suggest, a wider strategy once it became clearer that Blacks or other minorities were perhaps more vulnerable in the United States. And in addition to these white nationalists, favorite hobby of always blaming minorities, by the way, they've started to seek wider public appeal and support by calling for measures to control the virus in the US to be lifted as being overreach. Because in an almost subliminal way, there's the kind of hint that the virus will affect minorities more anyway, so white people should not be too concerned. Listen to some of the reporting from the United States, and you can actually feel this kind of coded message. So my 5 minutes are up. We have a lot to discuss about, so I shall stop here. But obviously, we have a lot more to talk about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your statement, Fernand. I think you raised a lot of things that we will get into more detail at in the course of this webinar. I would now like to give the word to Emma Lantschner for her statement.
Okay, yeah. First of all, thanks a lot also from my side for this very important initiative, and also for inviting me to be part of this today's session. I think Fernand has already touched on many issues that are of great relevance, of course, for minorities, and therefore I would like to talk a little bit about the broader perspective of equality and non-discrimination, speaking about probably also other groups that are suffering from non-discrimination, from discrimination in these particular times. Speaking about groups that if their characteristic then even intersects with ethnicity or a minority background, of course makes their situation even worse. And I'm trying to bring this the whole discussion also a little bit in the framework of the EU non-discrimination legal framework. And if we think of the grounds that are regulated under a EU law, according to which discrimination is prohibited, then of course, in addition to racial and ethnic origin, the grounds of gender, religion and belief, disability, age, and sexual orientation come to mind. And I would like to discuss a little bit these groups and how they are affected by the pandemic. And as I mentioned, as there are intersections also with ethnicity, often these groups are particularly at risk at the moment. So if, for instance, we think of LGBT community members, we know also from data that has been collected from the Fundamental Rights Agency in their surveys, for instance, that even before the crisis, members of this group were very often disproportionately affected from unemployment or precarious job situations. So already they had a lower socioeconomic status and sometimes also a lower health status, which was connected to biases held by healthcare providers and stigmatization, etc. So these are all pre-existing conditions which put them now, of course, also at a greater risk of being discriminated against during the pandemic. And then if we think of situations in which probably young members of this community that now during the confinement have to stay in their family and they probably haven't come out or they have come out and they were rejected by their family. This is of course also a major problem, and abuses or even violence in their family can then become a particular problem. And if we think in confinement that the contacts with services, help services, etc., are more difficult, or the abusers are constantly around you and make it also more difficult for you to get contact with outside support, makes the situation, of course, even worse. And then Fernand was already mentioning the scapegoating for persons belonging to certain ethnicity or a certain minority or religious groups, etc. But also the LGBT community has served as a target for this scapegoating exercise. On the other hand, I found it also quite interesting looking here at the situation in Austria that the pandemic also brought to light some legislation in different countries that have totally passed unnoticed over the past couple of years. There was, for instance, the case of a gay man, a man who caught the virus, and once he recovered, he wanted to donate his blood plasma in order to support the recovery of other people as well. When he found out that he was forbidden or he was banned from donating blood because of his sexual orientation. Of course, now the explanation is not that it's because of the sexual orientation, but because figures show that practicing gay, they show a higher possibility of having HIV, and therefore he's banned from donating. But this brings, of course, again the issue of whether such a legislation is discriminatory to the table, and this has been not really noticed by the larger society recently. So in that sense, the pandemic has also brought to light this kind of legislation and which might get further attention. So in that sense, it might even be, if you want, a positive side effect that these issues become more relevant in the society again. And then other groups and are, of course, that are also particularly hit by by the pandemic and by the curfews, etc., could be women and children. And again, for the same reason, if they are closer to potential abusers, or if they have seen abuse already before the crisis, it's of course now more difficult for them to get support, and psychological violence can quickly turn into physical violence, and they would be exposed, or they are exposed to such incidences, of course, now at a higher level than it used to be. And some countries really have come up with quite interesting measures, like I think it was in Spain that they agreed on a code that the women could use when they turn to the pharmacist to make them aware that the domestic violence is happening in their context, or hotels were turned into shelters for women. Some countries also came quickly up with contingency plans against gender-based violence, etc. But figures actually do show that there has been a rise of domestic violence during the pandemic. So some 30% plus in Spain and in France show this. And then, of course, unequal access to information for persons with disability, in particular deaf people, for instance, or people with hearing impairments is another problem where those people are facing discrimination. And again, the combination of a disability with a minority status makes this access even more difficult, if we also think of the limitations in terms of language, probably, which already limits the possibility for minorities to get access to information about the pandemic. And then certain other confinement measures targeting elderly, for instance, they have already been the target of constitutional courts judgments, for instance, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where people older than 65 were totally banned from leaving their houses. The same measure was also in place in Serbia for 5 weeks. So they were completely banned from leaving their houses day and night. And the Constitutional Court in Bosnia, for instance, found this to be a discrimination, also because no consideration or not sufficient consideration was given to the question whether more mild restrictions would have managed to achieve the same aim. And there was also no time limit in the case of Bosnia. So we see that these confinement measures are affecting all the grounds under which the European Union legislation is providing protection from discrimination. And as Fernand also mentioned, I would like to make this point again. So very often we see this intertwining of socioeconomic aspects with another component, be it from an LGBT community or from an ethnic community, or even age. So elderly, of course, the mortality among elderly is higher. That's something we know. But of course, the risk is also higher if the pre-existing health conditions that might be worse if someone had a lower level of education, had worked in physically more burdensome jobs. And of course, this is then playing into a situation where the elderly find themselves at a higher risk of getting this disease. And that's of course also a structural problem. So minorities, if they don't have the opportunities, the same opportunities also when it comes to education, when it comes to the job market, etc., then of course when they are elderly, then they might find themselves in situations where they are more affected by such a crisis than others. So people, to sum up, so maybe now the final statement for this introduction. So people that have been on the margins already before the crisis are hit more by the crisis and by the virus itself. But not only. I think what we are now already in the phase, in particular in Europe, where we can think about the long-term consequences. And I believe that also the long-term consequences for all the groups that I just mentioned, in particular when it comes also to employment and economy, etc., might be more kind of affecting those groups more than others. And therefore, it's really necessary to come up with suggestions or come up with ideas on how or which institutions can really make sure that this gap that existed already before is not widening now because of this phase of confinement, etc. And yeah, so I have a couple of ideas in mind what could be done or what kind of watchdogs there could be at national level or also international level, but I think I'll leave it maybe for the discussion and stop here. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emma, for your introductory statement. Regarding the watchdogs and the role of these organizations, there's also already a question from the audience, so we will be sure to get back on this later on. Mm-hmm. But I think what has emerged so far is really this issue of intersectionality that is really quite interesting. So how interconnected different types of diversity contexts are, and how poverty, belonging to a minority, having a bad healthcare status, and so on, are interconnected in determining what the outcome of COVID-19 on someone's status is. Switching now over to you, Roberta, I'd like to ask you for your introductory statement as well.
Yes, thanks a lot. I will be short because time is flying really. So I will focus on a few additional details. It is clear that we are all aware that the very commonly used and perhaps rhetorical slogan, "We are all in this together," is not valid for many minorities, at least not in the same way. We are not in this together, we are not in this together in the same way. Particularly those destitute minorities, deprived minorities find themselves in a systematic, structural sort of vicious circle of exclusion and discrimination that is linked, as it has been said, to pre-existing conditions. Obviously, not all minorities, so linguistic, religious, and cultural minorities, are poor and destitute and vulnerable in economic terms, but they are still vulnerable due to their diversities. And here I would like to focus on just 2 points. One is the risk of being a victim of indirect forms of discrimination. So victims of discrimination that results from measures that are not meant to discriminate. So they are neutral, their formulation is neutral and address everybody. But actually they do have, these measures do have a disproportionate effect on minorities, negative effect on minorities. And so we should focus on these types of discrimination that in any case bring states and governments also can be brought also in court for these measures that are, as I said, without, they're not adopted with the intention to discriminate, but they do still have the effect, a discriminatory effect. And then you have obviously direct, blatant forms of discrimination, including police brutality or police pervasive checks and so on. And these measures can be unlawfully and illegitimately justified by emergency legislation. So these are derogations allowed also by law, derogations from human or minority rights that may be allowed also by law, but to a certain extent. So that these measures are not discriminatory if are strictly adopted with aim to limit the pandemic. So these are cases, and the risk is the case of abuses of emergency powers that go, so what is strictly required or necessary to contain the pandemic. And these measures, these abuses are facilitated by large discretionary powers that are given to executive branch. And they might be adopted with a specific aim to silence dissident voices and marginalized minorities. So derogations from human and minority obligations used as a pretext to legitimize repressive and discriminatory practices against minorities. And my last point is about the risk that these repressive measures, so exceptional measures, become normalized, so are kept on a sort of permanent basis, to leading to a sort of police state. And unfortunately, this is not just an hypothetical scenario. If we consider that the economic crisis that the pandemic has brought in many countries may trigger also widespread protest and social unrest. And obviously this can be instrumentalized also, as it was mentioned before, and manipulated by anti-democratic and extreme rights movements. So this is clearly not a rosy scenario for many minorities, for the risk of scapegoating, hate speech, and further marginalization. Also because it's going to be difficult, and it has been already difficult with the social distances rule and restrictions to move, to collect evidence, to collect data, to interview victims. And so I'm not very optimistic that the situation after the pandemic will improve for minorities.
Thank you very much for your statement, Roberta. It's, I think it connects quite well with the first question that we had from the audience as well, because it also tackles the possible overpowering or the abuse of powers on behalf of the executive that we have seen. The question goes to all the three panelists, and it's mainly on these emergency measures that we've seen, which also affect minority contexts, so where minorities have self-rule. He's mentioning, or the person is mentioning specifically Spain with Catalonia and the Basque country, where there has also been these re-centralization efforts. And to put it in a broader term, how do you think the EU authorities, but also the United Nations, for example, could address these tendencies, these abuse of powers maybe on behalf of the governments, that they don't become permanent? And how could this be, could this lead to a scenario which in which international organizations can better exert also their watchdog role that was already talked about before, regarding the protection of discrimination and ensuring minority equality? So maybe we should go again in the order that we started. So with Fernand first to respond.
Thank you very much. In fact, the timing is quite interesting. This morning, some of my colleagues who are special rapporteurs issued a press release in relation to a crackdown in Malaysia. Crackdown targeting migrants, but also civil society organizations during this period. The dangers are obviously there. It's a very concrete situation. But I think there is perhaps a situation also of misreading and misunderstanding permissible measures that restrict freedom of expression or other human rights during this period of a pandemic. It's not because that some restrictions are permissible as long as they're proportionate and reasonable in relation to the measures that are needed to control the epidemic. Not every measure is allowable in terms of fundamental human rights, and such as restrictions to freedom of expression or association. So I think the danger here, as has been pointed out, is that there is abuse of what is permissible, even in this time of pandemic. And what we probably need is greater clarification of the extent that measures can be used that are, in fact, go too far. They're restrictive of fundamental human rights. So we probably need more clarity as to how far can the executive or even legislative branches of government go in terms of what kind of measures they can adopt. Because I think it is a fundamental misunderstanding to assume that the state can do almost anything during the time of a pandemic. That's obviously not the case. There are clear restrictions in international law, even in measures were not intended to discriminate, Intention is not necessary, obviously, in terms of the prohibition of discrimination in international human rights law. And in some situations, as it seems occurring in Malaysia, some of the measures that seem to target certain minorities, including migrants, by the way, are going way too far and are used to perhaps for other purposes also. So I think this is how I would answer. There are limits here. There are fundamental limits in terms of what human rights permit, even in a time of a crisis such as this one. And perhaps we haven't clarified this kind of situation as much as we could have or should have, because quite frankly, this is a very unique situation that we're encountering now in the modern era.
Yeah, thank you, Fernand. I think it's very true that this is something that nobody really has experienced so far there. So there are not many measures also in the international level or experiences on how to tackle such a situation. So it's very much in a process for everyone involved, I think. Emma, I'd like to hear your response next, please.
Yeah, I think all important exponents of international organizations, now it comes to my mind, for instance, the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, who very often in her speeches and in the documents that have been issued by the Secretary General, has always underlined that all the measures undertaken now during this pandemic must be in line with the principles of rule of law, democracy, and fundamental rights. And that's, of course, also those fundamental values that are contained also in Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union. So therefore, this is a shared, really, roof for all the organizations at the European level looking at the measures now undertaken during the pandemic. And I think a lot is being done by international organizations also to guide the states in taking appropriate measures. So the first thing that comes to my mind are the recommendations of the High Commissioner on National Minorities that were discussed also during the last webinar by High Commissioner Zanier. So they were really kind of trying to delimit what is the corridor within which states can move during such a pandemic. Then also the Council of Europe has put together, again, the Secretary General has put together a toolkit for states where it basically has listed also all the international standards that have to be respected in this current crisis, and also the limits that are set by international standards and what kind of measures can be taken. Another initiative which I found also very interesting by the Fundamental Rights Agency. So also the Fundamental Rights Agency has already come out with one report about the impact of these measures on particular groups, amongst them also minorities and refugees. And what they have also done is, so basically they have put online all basically the input that they received from their local contact points. So all the measures that have been undertaken by the states throughout the European Union can be, are publicly available, so to say, at the website of the Fundamental Rights Agency. So it's also interesting to have those measures basically exposed, and that can serve as an example if they have functioned well. But basically it's also coming along with an analysis of what has not worked. So there are those organizations that have come out very quickly with their assessment of the situation. Now that all speaks to the more general level of the measures, etc. But then if we come down to the individual level, so an individual who feels discriminated by a particular measure. So the question is also, what can such an individual then do? And there, I think it's also an instrument that all the European Union member states have had to establish in the course of the implementation of the Racial Equality Directive. They had to establish these so-called equality bodies. And one of the main tasks that every equality body must fulfill is to provide independent assistance to victims of discrimination. So basically, a person who feels himself or herself discriminated also by those measures can turn to those equality bodies, and they are there also to support victims of discrimination in court proceedings, etc. And of course, through this case-by-case work, they collect a lot of information also about what goes wrong basically with those measures. And they also have the task to carry out surveys and provide recommendations to the states then on how specific measures should be changed. But I'm also thinking now again in the long-term view, these bodies are for me really very important when it comes also to provide insight on how the crisis has impacted on equality, and they could also help anticipate further and future challenges. They are also there to collect data through surveys, etc. And so they are there to, with their expert knowledge, also to train stakeholders, important stakeholders like medical staff or law enforcement and legal professionals. So they play a very important role in now through the pandemic and also afterwards. But what we also see, and that comes a little bit into what Fernand has already said before, that also civil society organizations are breaking down. So these equality bodies have not always seen the necessary support by the states in terms of independence and also in terms of the required financial resources in order to carry out their mandate effectively. So this is something that has to be also on the radar of the European Commission to see whether those equality bodies have the mandate and have the resources to carry out their work.
Thank you, Emma. I think it's really something that, as already mentioned before, we'll have to look at in a long-term perspective here as well, especially regarding what international organizations can be doing. Roberta, I'd like to ask you next.
Yeah, again, as a third panelist, I have the advantage, if you want, or disadvantage to have listened to the other panelists, because most have been already said. Basically, my comment is that derogations, as Fernand said, are allowed by international law, also in case of public emergency, threatening the life of the nation. This is clearly the case of the pandemic, but obviously there are according to the exigence of the situation. So it's true that the law says that emergency measures should be enforced only if strictly necessary to limit and contain the virus, and that basically if less intrusive alternatives with potentially similar effectiveness are available should be preferred. But obviously this balance between individual rights and public interest is obviously very difficult to achieve. There is a large discretionary power and margin of decision given to states, and we also know that international organizations, in particular judicial bodies like the European Court of Human Rights, are pretty slow in their capability to intervene in certain situations. So I think that we need, at least from international organizations, to strengthen their monitoring and judicial bodies and their early warning mechanism. And also, as has been said, also the public opinion. So public opinion should be aware of the difficulties and the conditions of minorities, and we should not think that minorities are something marginal or negligible. If we if we want to achieve a social cohesion in integrated society, then we should really mobilize and spread out awareness against indifference and forms of egoism that obviously in this situation, in difficult time, may prevail, because everybody's tend to be concentrated on their own social, economic problems, and so we tend to neglect the more marginalized ones. Just two other comments. The occasion, the pandemic and the emergency measures will give many occasions for minorities to be discriminated against. Let's imagine in terms of abuses of emergency derogations. So imagine restrictions on gathering or use of public spaces for political rallies that may be selectively be applied, the restrictions to minorities, or measures allowing the authorities to prosecute journalists or limit freedom of expression with the excuse that these news, for example, cause panic, or they spread fake news, or the collection of data, personal data, medical data, but also data on who people infected were in contact with, or reporting on international travels. Excessive, as we said before, excessive police checks or patrolling or checks on certain neighbors, as we've seen in Bulgaria or Slovakia for Roma settlements. So there are many occasions in which these exceptional measures can further marginalize and be misused by certain governments with authoritarian tendency against minorities. Perhaps I have a minute for the EU. The EU, I think, should take this occasion of the pandemic to recuperate credibility and legitimization that the EU has lost during the refugee crisis. However, at the moment, the European Union, and particularly the President Ursula von der Leyen, is very concentrated on the economic crisis. So the debate is very much on the European Stability Mechanism, the Recovery Fund, and obviously this has also an impact on inequalities and protection of minorities if member states will use these measures, these budget, these funds also for achieving these objectives. But the position of the European Union, the President of von der Leyen, has been so far very ambivalent towards minorities. We should not forget that at the beginning of her mandate, a vice president of the Commission has been appointed with the title, with the task of promoting the European way of life. This has been severely criticized by human rights activists because it reveals obviously a certain propensity towards assimilation policies that obviously is not inspired by the motto of the European Union itself, united in diversity. So I think that the European Union should really take the COVID-19 as an opportunity, as I said, to recuperate credibility and perhaps, for example, support, but with concrete act, the minority safe pack, which is a set of proposals for the protection of minorities within the EU that is being blocked during the mandate of Jean-Claude Juncker, and is waiting for its approval in front of the European Parliament for the last month. This would be really a concrete signal of the European Union beyond rhetorical speeches and statements that will give this sign in this difficult and precarious time as COVID-19 emergencies brought about all of us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Roberta. I think that you are already moving into the direction that I'd also like to go in now for the final round already, because we are already approaching the end of the webinar. So you are already speaking about the future, or what the EU should do. So my final question to the panelists would be, if you imagine you have a crystal ball and you look into it and see the world 1 year from now, where do you think minorities will stand, or what the situation of minorities will be post COVID-19? And also, which issues should the legal experts and the policymakers work on in order to improve the situation that we have now? Let's go in the order again with Fernand first.
Thank you. And my comments will be on perhaps more at the global level. We need to clarify what are the human rights of minorities. We need to clarify how to protect minorities more effectively in key areas which are relatively recent, such as hate speech and social media. What we have in place right now is not sufficient. It's not sufficient, certainly at the global level, where we do not have an instrument dealing with the human rights of minorities and their protection. So we have situations, for example, where, if I can just focus a bit on Europe, as I mentioned at the beginning, only 21%, apparently only 21% of minorities have access to information during this pandemic in their own language. This is symptomatic of something missing. And what is missing is, just on that very narrow field, what exactly are the human rights of minorities to non-discrimination in the area of health care information in this pandemic, during this pandemic? I am familiar with the report of the Fundamental Rights Agency, for example, connected to the COVID recent report. It refers to language issues, but almost only in the context of migrants or asylum seekers. And I think that's problematic. It's much more than that. When you talk about minorities, you're talking about all linguistic minorities, including national minorities. And I think there's sometimes not a full appreciation of what is the prohibition of discrimination, what are the human rights of minorities in many areas, and including in practical situations such as access and appropriate measures during a pandemic that actually reflects the reality of the minorities and their communities. To summarize, I think we need more clarity, as I mentioned earlier. What we have in terms of what are the human rights of minorities are certainly insufficient, almost inexistent at the global level. And even in Europe, I don't think there's enough understanding and clarity along those lines. So in 1 year's time, that's what I would hope for. Something which provides greater guidance, substance to what are the human rights of minorities in areas that we are now experiencing and which we find challenging. Not only the pandemic, but areas of hate speech and other abuses directed at minorities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fernand. Emma?
Yeah, so your question had two parts. So what do I think the situation will look like? And the second was, what do I hope it will look like, more or less? So I think I said already in my introductory statement that if there is not a really very strong and focused kind of approach, both at the national and international level, to make sure that those that have been at the margins before, that have been moved even more to the margins during the crisis, do not even be pushed out from society altogether. So I think it's very important to have here a very concerted approach at different levels. And I think I agree with Fernand that at many levels there needs to be more clarity. But I also think that there are already many instruments there. So that's now going in the direction of wish. But I also feel that in particular now, Roberta was already touching the European Union level, and I would like to go further here, that also when it comes to the EU non-discrimination directive, so there is a decade or more than a decade long talk now already about leveling up the non-discrimination directive. So that would be high time to really draw the lessons also from the pandemic and go about that. And yes, I agree, Roberta, with this very criticized denomination of one of the commissioner's offices, but this commission is also the first one to have a commissioner dealing with equality. And this commissioner dealing with equality, from what I found, is quite engaged, and she also announced new legislative proposals in the field of equality and non-discrimination, and we will see whether these new pieces of legislation that they will come up with really draw the lessons from the pandemic. And I also see that the Commission, already the previous Commission, and I have the feeling that also this one, they are seeking the cooperation also with important stakeholders in the field. So I'm particularly thinking about Equinet, which is a European network of equality bodies. So there have been meetings with Equinet and commissioners in order to identify what have been the issues that have been brought up by the member organizations already and how they could be addressed. And I would hope that this all flows into a strategic approach to the whole planned legislation after COVID. And when we talk about financial measures, so now they are negotiating, or there is talk about 500 millions, and I would hope that some of this money would also go in a direction of support to those institutions at the local and national level that support individual victims of discrimination. And then a final point, I think there are a lot of monitoring bodies out there at the level of the European, at the level of the Council of Europe and the United Nations. I'm particularly thinking, of course, at the Advisory Committee on the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, and at the UN level, for instance, at CEDAW, so the committee that is overseeing the implementation of the Convention Against Discrimination Against Women, but also ICERT, so the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. That's one of those documents that has not been so much in focus in recent years maybe, but I think with this new forms of racism and hate speech that have now appeared also during the crisis, this is probably also one of the documents that will have a kind of a revival probably also. So I think it's also important to for all those monitoring bodies to have the consequences, the long-term consequences of these measures and the pandemic overall on their radar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. Roberta, your future scenario in very short time.
But the future scenario, I think that will depend very much on our capacity to monitor the emergency legislation, especially because, as I said, after the economic crisis will probably come also. We will have a period of time of social unrest and with movements exploiting unemployment of people, anger, frustration of people. So we have to monitor that emergency legislations, especially those impacting on minorities, are not in place on a permanent basis, and they are only in place for the scope and time strictly necessary to contain the virus. Against scapegoating and hate speech, I think we should, in a future scenario, I think we should apply the same approach that most of the population in the world, I would say, because it is a pandemic that has affected most of the global population. So we should apply the same approach that we use against the virus. So listening to the experts and scientists, so use a sort of common sense to media and fake news, more science, more facts, a more critical approach against fake news and scapegoating. And I hope that this will be a sort of legacy, a lesson that we learned from the pandemic. And we need, obviously, a public opinion that does not consider minorities, as I said, something sidelined, something that is not relevant for the whole picture of a society, because we have to fight also against forms of indifference and egoism. However, all of these lessons that we might have learned from the virus, I don't think that will be sort of learned by most of us. History tells us that men have a very short memory, so we will probably repeat the same mistakes in other similar occasions in the future. So in this regard, I'm not very optimistic. Many are already saying that they would like to return to the good old days, and this will mean for many, especially many minorities, to return to bad old days, bad old times of discriminatory practices and habits, and unfortunately also new discriminatory practices. So I don't want to close this webinar in a pessimistic note, but this is my feeling.
Thank you very much, Roberta. It's unfortunate that we close on a pessimistic note, but I think you've all made some very good points. So if, as Roberta now says, the policymakers and the decision makers will listen to the experts, so we'll listen to people like you, then hopefully we will be in a better situation regarding minorities and discrimination a year from now on. So I'd like to close the seminar by thanking again the panelists that were with us today. So Fernand de Varennes, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues, Emma Lantschner, Professor of Law at the University of Graz, and Roberta Medda-Windischer, who is Senior Researcher at the Institute for Minority Rights at Eurac Research. And please allow me to take the time to also thank all the colleagues at Eurac Research that are working on this very hard behind the scenes, conceptualizing and planning this, particularly Johanna Mitterhofer, and also today our question taker, Kerstin Wonisch, who has been very helpful in passing the audience's interesting questions on to me. So thank you also to the audience for your questions that kept this discussion going. And finally, I'd like to remind you that our webinar series will go on. So please make sure to also tune in again next Wednesday, May the 27th at 3 p.m. Central European Time, where we will have our next episode of the webinar titled Minorities, Territorial Governance and Interstate Relations in Pandemic Times. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Good.